Hey folks, back for another edition of the Reclamation Transformation. I'm Mark Scroggins with Scroggins Law Group, and today we have Cindy Hyde back again.
Yeah.
How are you?
I'm good, Mark. How are you?
I am good. So, as y'all will recall, this is
Yeah.
a continuing guest that we have here
Mhm.
with Cindy because there's so much to talk about in the world of mental health. But what I wanted to do is start back really where we left off the last time, and we were talking
Mhm.
about narcissism. What is it really? And I was telling you, in the courts, one of the
Mhm.
things that's like narcissism, or hearing that someone's a narcissist,
Right.
is, the hot button of the day, to
Mhm.
where, the courts have actually gotten kind of, they've soured, I guess, on
Mhm.
hearing about it a lot of time, because everybody claims that everybody's a narcissist because they've got Google and they think they know what the hell it
Mhm.
means. So let's start there
Yep.
with talking about what is narcissism really,
Right.
and what's important. I think from a legal standpoint, what is it important for me to know as a
Mhm.
practitioner, and how I can go about really educating a court on what
Mhm.
the difference is between narcissism and, say, someone who's borderline, and all these other things that
Right.
we get into.
Right. Yeah, and you're exactly right, Mark. It is nowadays difficult for the courts to determine, is it narcissism or is it not? And that is because the term is so widely overused. And
Hmm.
it's overused a lot by bloggers and Facebook groups and all of these different outlets that really have no formal training in a
Exactly.
lot of cases. And so what happens is the general public starts thinking, they have a bad relationship or a toxic relationships. Well, they must be a narcissist, right? Well, and yes, that can actually be the case.
Sure.
There do seem to be a lot. However, a lot of times it's not just narcissism. And so what I tell clients is it's a personality disorder. Let's start there, because
Okay.
it may not be narcissism, or it might be with two or three other personality disorders also. And so in the world of mental health, there's narcissism, there's antisocial, which is also known as sociopath. There's psychopathy, which is known as psychopath, and then there's also narcissism, and then the last one, which kind of falls off to itself, is borderline. But
Ugh.
someone could potentially have all of those at the same time.
Right.
And so what happens is I get clients that come in and say, I feel like I'm going crazy. You probably get those clients too. And that's
Absolutely.
why, because they haven't been with just a narcissist.
Right.
They've been with someone that has multiple personality
Well,
disorders.
let's talk
Mhm.
about, what does narcissism
Mhm.
look
Mhm.
like
Yep.
in a relationship,
Yep.
because that's one of the
Mhm.
things that I find myself trying to educate my judge,
Mhm.
about. Judge, I know everybody thinks they know what this means, but let's talk about
Mhm.
what it really looks like. And,
Mhm. Right.
so let's
Mhm.
talk about that
Okay.
for a standpoint
Yep.
from someone who really knows what it what
Right.
it looks
Right.
like and what it
Right.
means.
And so what it truly is grandiosity. So
Okay.
you have somebody that has that big personality. They're never wrong. They have a huge sense of entitlement. They also can be very exploitive within the relationship. And so that's where you hear the terms like crazy making or word salad. And so they'll exploit in the relationship itself. They also lack empathy for the harm that they do to someone. And so that's one of the biggest ways you can tell if there's narcissism present, when someone has no empathy or remorse for the fact that they're hurting you. And so that's one of the larger ways that you can tell. In addition to that, a lot of times you can tell a narcissist because they associate with high status people, or they're very envious of high status people. And so, you've heard people say before, oh, I know, you know, so and so's brother's husband was the secretary to the president, right? And so
Hmm.
they attach to that status. And so also too, they usually show a very arrogant and haughty behavior. And so that's a narcissist by itself. If you wanted to know like what other things show up as personality disorders, and if someone were a psychopath, they have the pathological lying that goes along with this. A lot of times people just think that's just a narcissist. No, that can actually be a psychopath when there's pathological lying, or there's criminality, or there's that high egocentricity. So it's all about me.
Is it necessary, when we're talking about someone who's a psychopath, is it necessary
Mm-hmm.
that you have that illegal
Mm-hmm.
behavior?
No, it's not. They don't have to have criminality.
Okay.
A lot of times they don't. They'll have everything but the criminality. So they'll be highly manipulative and deceitful. They'll be a pathological liar, but they don't have any criminal behavior. They might like dabble in some shady stuff, but they don't necessarily have criminality.
Okay.
And then the antisocial, though, is the one that can have the criminality, that they're above the law, that they do everything within the letter of the law. So if you had a restraining order that said you can't be within 500 feet, they would be at 501. And they would say, oh, I wasn't at 500 feet. I was
Right.
at 501. Right. So that's kind of how you can tell a sociopath is they're always, above the law. And so they usually also have a high impulsivity. Usually they'll switch jobs a lot. So you'll see that as well with a sociopath. And then borderline is the high emotionality. So that's that explosive behavior. It can look a lot like bipolar.
Yeah.
But it can be the high emotionality, the explosiveness, the rage, which also shows up with psychopathy.
Right.
And it can also be the meltdowns, going to victim that, I only hit you because you made me do it. And they'll go to that victim meltdown stage. When in actuality, a victim can think that they're dealing only with a narcissist with all of those behaviors, but they're actually dealing with multiple personality disorders.
Are there certain of these personality disorders that tend to affect men more than women and women more than men?
Typically more men than women. I don't really have the research that says why that is. I know that it's out there. I don't know it off the top of my head. But there are women also that can very much display these personality disorders as well.
Don't you see borderline more in women actually than men?
Yeah,
It's the
borderline
others
is,
that are...
yep. Yeah, it's borderline is more in women most of the time. It can show up in men. Usually if they have multiple personality disorders, you'll see borderline as one of those also. But normally the narcissism and the psychopath and sociopath are more typically with men.
So if you were, so all the things you were talking about are things that I hear from clients all the time.
Right.
All right. So if, one of the things I will tell people is what you and I were having this discussion offline is, document everything.
Absolutely document everything.
Absolutely have to document everything. And additionally, if there's anybody else present, I will tell people that, the more evidence that you have, the better, because when it comes down to a he said, she said, that generally turns into a losing proposition.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're going to lose, so to speak, but you're not going to win on everything. I mean, some of the stuff is going to be taken with a grain of salt, right? And so it's trying to make sure that you've got the ability to show that, hey, judge, he or she is doing this and this and this and this and this and this. Oh, and these two. And then this person was here when this and this happened.
Right.
So,
and what you want to show is the enduring patterns of behavior. So meaning over time. Right. And so a lot of times I'll tell clients, or clients will bring me recordings of, somebody exploding on them or raging, and they have multiple recordings over time. And so that's an enduring pattern. That's something a judge could look at and go, this is a problem, right? Where if it's just a he said, she said, what happens a lot of times is the victim actually will look very unstable in court because they can be being provoked unknowingly to everyone around them.
Right.
And so they'll look unstable while the personality disordered person looks really smooth. And so it can be very difficult if there's not proof.
Yeah. How would you go about trying to discern whether or not someone is actually I hate to use the term victim, but someone who is actually a victim in this scenario, as compared to someone who is really more of a provocateur and trying to set someone up? Because that's generally what the dialogue is. It's, you were provoking me. No, I'm really the victim, this, that, and the other. And so it kind of goes back and forth between these two. So how do you go about discerning, for lack of a better way of putting it, what's true?
Yeah. And what comes to my mind is the recent Johnny Depp, court
Yeah,
What's the word I'm looking for? But the big court trial,
right, their
with
defamation
Johnny
trial.
Depp, and literally both of them were saying the other one did it, which is so typical of
Right,
a pathological love relationship case.
right.
And so actually the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction watched every inch of that footage
Right.
and said, in the end of the day, they really felt like both of them were personality disordered. And that's why there was so much chaos in the courtroom over all of that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. And give the name of the institution again.
Yep. It's called the Institute of Relational Harm Reduction.
Okay.
Their website is saferelationshipsmagazine.com.
Okay. Very
And
good.
they've done 30 plus years of research on the subject of pathological love relationships, and they have more research than anyone out there right now.
And so when we talk about pathological love relationships, can you explain to the folks out there what that really means?
Yeah, and that means when you're in a relationship with someone with a personality disorder or multiple personality disorders.
Okay.
And so that is, and a lot of people in our world today and in all of the blogging and Facebook groups, they call it toxic relationships, right?
Right,
But
right.
it's actually pathological because they are truly in a relationship with somebody that's disordered.
And would it be a situation where that person does not have the ability to make a change, even if they so want?
Correct, yeah. What the Institute says is 97% of that population is born that way, and only 3% had environmental situations that caused them to be that way. But either way, the neural pathways in the brain are different. So how they relate it is that if someone is born on the spectrum or with autism, they're going to die on the spectrum and with autism, right?
Yep.
Same thing with a personality disorder. If they were born that way with a personality disorder, at the end of the day, they're going to die with a personality disorder also. So it will not change. And that's one of the ways that we work with victims, is to help them understand that even though their brain wants to believe that this person's going to change, because that's why they go back so many times, right? But the person really is incapable of change. Even if it was environmental, even if they were one of the 3%, their neural pathways got changed in their trauma, and they're not able to change back.
Wow. Okay. So that's even something with undergoing therapy and, things of that sort, that it's just not.
Yeah, most won't do therapy because they don't think they need it. They're always right.
Right.
And so they think everyone else is the problem, but they're not the problem. So, even if they do get into a therapeutic situation, they usually won't stay very long.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's, one of the other things we were talking about, it seems like abuse generally goes along with these types of relationships, right?
Right.
And so let's talk about, what is abuse actually, what is abuse, first of all, and what does that look like in these relationships?
Yeah. So the first thing I do usually with clients is we'll go through the power and control wheel that the National Domestic Violence Centers use.
Okay.
And so what I usually look for is if the person they've been with has used intimidation. So that's things like they make the victim feel afraid by using gestures or smashing things or giving them a certain look. So they're instilling fear with intimidation. The next thing I look at is if there's been emotional abuse.
Let me interrupt here for just a second, because one of the things I wanted to mention is, one of the places that we have a problem in Texas is, so Texas only has assault, okay?
Right.
Doesn't have assault and battery.
Right.
So it doesn't discern between the two, except, I guess, the category or level of
Correct.
assault. But a lot of people don't realize that an assault does not necessarily mean, that somebody hits
Physical.
you. It also can be if you were, reasonably in fear of imminent personal injury. So when you talk about someone smashing things and breaking things like that, the perfect example I think of is somebody has someone backed up against the wall and they rear back and they put a hole in the wall by punching the wall, right? Okay. That's an assault in Texas. Okay. And so with that, you can actually still get a protective order. So that's one of those areas that, although it is a little grayer than I would like, it is still an area that I can do something about.
That's
I can
great.
get somebody relief. But when we start going into some of these other areas, that gets into a super what I will call a light gray
Right.
area
Yeah.
where there's
Right.
where I'm kind of stuck. I
Yeah.
mean, there's just not really a good legal
Right.
mechanism that allows me to provide some of the relief that I think my clients like.
Right.
So sorry, I
Yeah.
wanted to interject
Well,
there
and
for
that's where, a lot of clients after it's been, or a lot of victims after it's been happening for a while will start recording.
Right.
Or they'll start, they'll make sure somebody's nearby. A lot of these abusive men or women will do this behind closed doors where there's no witnesses.
Right.
But sometimes, there's children.
Right.
And sometimes they can be a witness if they're old enough.
Right.
So, but that's what I tell my clients, that the ones that come to see me, is that, as much documentation as you can get.
Absolutely.
Because that will help you in the legal system.
Right.
But yeah, it's great to know that they can get, I had one client not long ago that she had video of him smashing furniture and throwing things and just really losing it.
Right.
And, she was able to get a protective order with that.
Yep.
So he never physically put a hand on her, but the imminent threat was there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. So let's, you said using emotional abuse. So
Correct.
what does that
Yep.
look like?
So putting her down, calling her names, making her feel bad about herself, calling her crazy, playing mind games. So in other words, even though she might have, seen evidence that he was cheating, he wasn't cheating, so he would gaslight her, to make her feel like she's the crazy one, even though he's the one with the bad behavior, humiliating her, trying to make her feel guilty for his abuse. So maybe he got violent in her face, but then he made her feel guilty that it was all her fault that he did what he did. And
Right.
again,
If she just didn't get him so worked up and
correct,
kept poking and prodding and
correct,
it's like the whole thing, the nagging wife, to use a perfect stereotype there, the nagging wife who then the husband loses it, and if you didn't do this, then I wouldn't act like know.
And again, this could be a woman doing this to a man too.
Right, yeah.
But so many women in our culture, especially in my generation and a few years younger than me, were raised that you were to be submissive to your husband. And so a lot of them will pick up that guilt and feel like, well, maybe if I just did something different, then he wouldn't. And so there's a psychological abuse component just to that.
Right.
But it comes from childhood,
Right.
that they were taught that they should tolerate anything. Maybe they even saw it with a parent.
Right.
And they felt like, well, my mom, stayed, so then I should stay. And so that happens a lot too. But another way that they abuse is using isolation. So they'll start telling you that your friends or your family are bad, or they don't like them, or, they treat them bad, so therefore they shouldn't, associate with them. So they'll start trying to get them away from friends and family pretty soon because they don't want anybody speaking truth to them.
Right.
So they usually do that pretty quickly.
Yeah. So using isolation, that one's interesting, because that's one of the things that I have conversations with my client about all the time. It is amazing to me. You can pretty much go down a checklist and say, is he or she doing this? Is he or she doing that? And going down, and one of them seems like, they want to isolate you away from all of your close friends and family. And
Yep. And they'll do that using jealousy too. So what they'll do is, if you go somewhere publicly with them, they'll accuse you of looking at someone, or they'll say, I know, if you ask, a waiter where the restroom is, you were flirting with the waiter, and you saw that they must have a thing going on. And so then the fight for the next month becomes about the waiter and the fact that, you must have been talking to him, you've been seeing him. And so they'll use those kinds of things.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And so they'll even start monitoring what they read, who they talk to, everything. A lot of them will make sure that they're in charge of the cell phones, so that they can see who they're talking to, who they're texting, everything. So that they'll literally put them in a prison, where they're in charge of everything. Then they minimize and deny and then blame shift. So they minimize that they're doing any of those things, that they are jealous, or that they're monitoring their phone calls. They minimize all of that. Or if they cheat, they deny it. And then they'll blame shift. Well, if you were just having more sex with me, then I wouldn't have had to cheat. So, they'll use those types of tactics. They'll even use the children. So they'll tell the children, like, you act like your mother, or, I know that you see how your mother acts, and I don't want you to act that way. So they'll do things like that to make the children go against the safe parent, because the safe parent's usually the one getting abused.
So trying to equate bad behavior with that
with the safe
parent. Gotcha.
Right, correct, yeah. And so and once they get to, and we'll talk about that in a second, but once there's a separation, they'll start using, they may not want to give the child back, or they may try to keep the child longer than they should in order to torture the parent that they have separated from. Another thing that they'll do is what's called using male privilege. And so they'll become the god of the house or the king of the castle, right? And so they'll define the male and the female roles. So usually the wife or the partner becomes basically the servant. And so, and while, they do next to nothing, the spouse is doing everything. And then they criticize the things that the spouse is doing.
So one of the other things I see on here is, and by the way, folks, if anybody wants a copy of this power and control wheel or any of the other things you hear us referencing, if you will send an email to info@Scroggins Law Group, we'll be happy to provide those to you. One of the other things that I see is making all big decisions. And so, or acting, you mentioned acting like the master of the castle. Help me understand how that is different than what I will call traditional gender roles.
Yeah. And, like I said earlier, our generation we grew up with traditional gender roles where the man was the head of the household and the wife usually did most of the housework until women started going back into the workforce.
Right.
And back then it really wasn't considered abuse. But nowadays, when it's including isolation and they're making it where that person is truly a servant versus a partner in the house, then that makes it more abuse.
Because the one that I see is the making big decisions. And so that's a scary one to me, just because I can tell you of a recent case that I had where husband and wife getting a divorce. Wife is complaining that, he financially isolated me and this, that, and the other. And it turned out that was really pretty much bullshit. That he had provided all of the login information and this, that, and the other. She just didn't
know how.
Well, no, she knew how. She just didn't take advantage of it. And so it was, he never sat there and walked me through everything. It's like, well, you need to get off your ass and actually do something. And so there's a fine line, it seems to me, on doing that. So anytime, and obviously being male, that kind of scares me when we start talking about, the use of male privilege and we start getting into something where people have decided that they're going to have what I will call traditional gender roles there, and they're not going to share in certain things. Now that's different than, we're going to buy this house and we're going to live in this city and we're going to raise the kids this way. And, we're going to decide you're going to homeschool the kids and all this out of bounds, totally out of bounds. But,
and I think it goes to say if one of the partners does not have any choices, if there's no choices, and they're just simply told this is what you're doing, then that's where it becomes abusive. But if the partner had a choice, then there's not an abuse factor there. Right.
And would you agree then that this is really something that it needs to be coupled with other things on this wheel? Would that be correct?
Correct, yes. And you kind of touched on it, getting into the economic abuse.
Right.
So there are situations where a spouse is allowed no money whatsoever unless it's doled out in very small amounts.
Right.
That is abusive. Because in Texas, as you know, 50-50, right? And so unless there's a really good prenup. And so, but when someone
actually, it's community. 50-50 is a starting point.
Correct.
So, and very rarely is it actually 50-50.
Oh,
so
good to know.
Yeah. Unless you get into, really substantial money and then it doesn't really matter what kind of fault there is, then it's going to be 50-50.
Right.
But
yeah.
So anyway.
Which, and I think that's a whole topic in and of itself, because I know a lot of my clients have those questions when they come in and when they're trying to decide, what should I do?
Right.
It's good information to have of, does it start at 50-50 or is it 50-50? So
yeah. And that's the starting point. So that's one of the things, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that there's a lot of misinformation about that. People think, well, and it's amazing. They come in, well, you know, I know that Texas is a community property state,
Mm-hmm.
so I know division's going to be 50-50. And it's like, no, you really don't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's not the case. You know, generally it is the starting point, but then you've got different things that are going to shift, you know, a couple percentage points here and a couple percentage points there. And if there's a significant disparity in earning capacity, that's the big one. That's where you can see things all of a sudden end up with a 60-40 split or something like that, depending on just how severe the disparity is.
Right.
So
That's good to know.
Yeah.
So, in the terms of abuse, when they use economic abuse, what the National Domestic Violence Center says is this: that they prevent them from getting or keeping a job. I've had clients tell me about how their partner got them fired from 3 or 4 different jobs, you know, because they would, you know, come up and have a big explosion at their office or something like that, and they would get fired. You know, if they are making them ask for money, so therefore there is no money that they're allowed to touch unless they ask for it. They're given only a little pittance of an allowance. They take the money that person brings in. So that happens a lot where
it does.
Where, you know, they'll have, I know of one that works 2 or 3 jobs and all the money goes to him first. And then he decides how much of that she gets. And so, not letting her know about or have access to the family income like you were talking about earlier, sometimes that gets misunderstood. So it has to be very clear that the victim had 0 choices, that it was all taken. And then the last thing is using coercion and threats. So making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt them. A lot of times too, what they'll do is threaten divorce a lot, and then that leaves the victim terrified because they have no financial means, because all of the money's being held by, you know, the partner. Sometimes they'll threaten suicide, although I will say most of the time they don't carry that out. It's just a threat in order to get control. And so
let me mention one thing, because I'm glad you mentioned this with the threatening of divorce and people, you know, that being abusive because people not understanding really what their rights are. So one of the things, if you have somebody who is threatening divorce over and over, go consult with a divorce lawyer so you can learn what your rights are, because what you are being told is not accurate. That is not what your rights are. You absolutely are entitled to the money just as much as, let's say, if you're a stay-at-home.
Right.
Okay? You are just as entitled to the money the wage earner makes as the wage earner his or herself. You know, so it's important to understand what your rights are there. So that can take some of the fear out of it, and hopefully then with removing some of that fear, then you can think clearly and make a determination as to what is good for you and what is not.
Yeah, I'm curious. I have that brought up a question. I had one not long ago that, you know, this kind of situation, not allowed to work, threatened divorce all the time. But there's also, even though he's the primary breadwinner, well, the only breadwinner, he's also got business debt. And so her concern is will she be responsible for the debt too?
Yeah. Great question. And that really, it really depends. So typically, no. Okay. So you've got questions there of, is it a business she is involved in at all? Is it a business that was started during the pendency of the marriage? So if it was started during the pendency of the marriage, then it's going to be community. Okay. And so the question there will really be, what is the what is the value of the business itself? And then the bigger questions become one really of retained earnings. So that's where something can be abusive, even if it's a separate property business. So separate property business, still all of the income that's generated is community property. Okay. And so those retained earnings are community in nature. So just because someone hasn't distributed what they can doesn't mean that there isn't money that's in the business. So that's one of the things that you always want to look at. But it's just like a company can't be divested of their property. It's just like the debt isn't going to be divested if it's in the name of the company. Now, if it is debt that is just in his name, you know, could she be held liable? I guess technically she could, but it's very unlikely.
Right.
It's very unlikely.
Okay.
So that's a pretty hollow threat a
Yeah.
lot of the time.
Yeah.
Where, oh, you're going to be held just as responsible as I am for that.
Right.
Bullshit.
Right.
Not going to happen.
Yeah. So that's how we determine abuse, all of the ways that we just talked about. But then there's a whole nother, area to look at too, is when there's children involved.
Right.
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 And so a lot of times people think as soon as I leave, I'm never going to have to deal with this abuse again.
Right.
And that is actually false.
Yeah.
It's what's called post-separation abuse.
Right.
And that abuse takes place once the victim has left, and
Right.
typically with the children. And so that's usually when there's an 18-year battle that ensues until the child's old enough.
Yep.
And I don't know if you caught the recent Pamela Anderson documentary or not.
I have
But
not.
she was talking about, she left Tommy Lee because he was abusive,
Right.
and they had 2 children together. Right. And so once she left, she was talking about how it was a long 18 years, and that's pretty much what happens in these types of situations. Is it becomes a very long 18 years of post-separation abuse that happens after they've left.
So when you talk about post-separation abuse, can you tell me what specifically you are referencing? And here we've got another wheel.
Yep, we got another wheel. And this wheel can be found on One Mom's Battle.
Okay.
You can also look for post-separation abuse on Google and go to images and find wheels for it too.
Okay.
But, a lot of times what the personality disordered parent will do is they try to alienate the child, and they do that by smearing the safe parent. And so they'll start trying to set the children up to favor the unsafe parent versus the safe parent. So you hear the term Disney dad. So a lot of times the unsafe parent will become Disney dad, and it makes the safe parent look like, she's not doing anything that's
fun,
supportive of the children, or fun.
Right.
And so anything that is bad that happens, or anything that doesn't go well, gets blamed on the safe parent.
Right.
And so I'm sure you've had lots of cases for parental alienation.
All the time.
A lot of times.
All the time.
That's what's happening, is one of the parents is trying to alienate from the other parent. So they'll do that by befriending the child.
That's another one that's really hard, because I don't think a lot of judges really have a clear understanding of what parental alienation is.
Right.
And there are a lot of people who don't. It's frankly, parental alienation is another one of those buzz terms that is very akin to narcissism.
Correct.
When we start saying, oh, well, it's a clear, case of parental alienation. It's like, just because they see things differently doesn't mean that that's parental alienation.
Right.
You've got to be showing what is actually doing, what is going on, to show that they are trying to create a situation where the child disfavors that other parent.
Right. Yeah. So again, documentation.
Yes.
But, so it could be a case like there could be a sex addict parent, right, who had years of acting out behavior and disclosed one of the affairs to the child, and then blamed the safe parent for not forgiving them, even though the safe parent knows there were dating apps and there were prostitutes and there were all kinds of very bad behavior for many years in the marriage. But yet the child is being told that it's only because the safe parent won't forgive for the one affair, right? So not only is the unsafe parent lying to the child, which they should, because the child doesn't need to know all of that, right? But it's painting the safe parent as the bad parent.
Right.
And so now the child wouldn't want anything to do with the safe parent, because they think it's their fault that the divorce is happening, even though they know about the one affair. So it's things like that can happen that turn a child against a safe parent. And so a lot of times, once the separation happens and the personality disordered person has the child in their possession, even if it's, based on custody arrangements, they start neglecting the child.
Let me go back to one thing real quick, because we talked about after the separation actually takes place. And one of the questions that always comes up is, why does he or she always go back? So that's one of the things. And I think that's something that in the legal system that judges have a hard time really dealing with. It's like, well, if it was so bad, they wouldn't keep going back. If he really did all this, or if she really did all this, they wouldn't go back.
Yeah, and that's such a good point, because it's so true. Like, I could see where a judge would be confused. Like, wow, you went back 4 times. Why would how do I know that was really abusive if you kept going back?
Right.
Well, what happens in the victim is what gets created is called cognitive dissonance, which means on the one hand, they have the hope and belief that they're going to change and be different. And the reason they have that hope and belief is because of the early love bombing, the brain attached to that. And so they keep thinking that, well, that person's going to show up again, and so everything's going to be different if I go back. And a lot of times the personality disordered person is telling them that everything's going to be different, that, they're going to change, it's all going to be different. And so, the victim holds on to that belief and goes back. And then as soon as they're back, usually it's right back to the bad behavior, because the good behavior, because truly they're in what's called a dual relationship. So you've heard Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so it truly is a dual relationship, meaning he's good, he's bad, I love him, I loathe him, I don't know which to believe, right? And so her brain wants to go over here and believe that there's that sliver of good, that eventually if he just goes to anger management, then he'll be better. Right?
Yep.
Well, he can't, because he can't change. Because remember, his personality disorder, if he was born that way, or even if he was part of the 3% that wasn't, his neural pathways are not wired for that. And so they won't ever change. So he will always be bad. And so that's what her brain can't reconcile, that he can't change. Right? Because he's telling her he can, but yet he can't sustain it when she goes back. And so she'll go back and endure more abuse, and finally get brave enough to leave again. And then he'll start telling her again, like, I'm going to change. It's going to get better. You know how much I love you. And she goes back again. And so that's how that happens, because her brain is playing tricks on her, trying to make her think that the good can be sustained.
So it's basically, it's just like any other kind of addiction pattern.
Oh, absolutely it is.
So,
absolutely it is.
Like the alcoholic or the drug addict who thinks, oh, no, this time it's going to be different. This time it's not going to get me.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the whiskey and milk story, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's in the AA Big Book, and it's about the power of addiction, and how you can keep going back even when you think you can control it. And it's the same way with a person. The victim becomes somewhat addicted to the personality disordered individual. And so what happens is when they lose that person, just like if somebody took a bottle away from an alcoholic, they almost grieve they almost grieve the loss of their addiction, their drug, right?
Yeah.
So that person now has become their drug. And so what can happen is it can cause their PTSD symptoms to be stronger. And so what that can show up looking like is emotional overwhelm, high irritability, right? So, and a lot of people don't even realize that's part of the trauma and PTSD, but it is. And so what happens is the longing and the craving start within the victim, and so they're craving their drug,
right?
And so this is like setting them up to relapse or to go back to that person. And so what then can happen is that they can start like self-destructive behavior. Maybe the victim starts numbing out with food. Have you ever seen somebody that leaves a relationship and gains a lot of weight?
Yeah.
Well, they're trying to numb the drug that they've lost, which in this case is a person.
Right.
And so what'll happen then is they may start getting into relapse behavior. So maybe they fall prey to the craving or to the longing. So it would be kind of like an alcoholic just taking a sip, right? So maybe they'll just send that text. You know,
right.
Maybe if I just tell him this one more thing, because her brain is still thinking she can get heard by this abusive person, and
right.
she can't.
Right.
But yet she's about to fall into a relapse pattern because she's made contact, right? And so what then happens, it's kind of like that sip of alcohol, right? So maybe the next thing is she offers sex and thinks, well, we always had great sex. I can just have sex with him and that's it. Kind of
Right.
like I can drink that glass of wine and I will be fine,
Right.
right?
Right.
Same thing,
Right.
right? And so then the acting out behavior gets worse. She's going back again. She's leaving. She's going back. She's leaving. And what she discovers is just like in the bottle, there's no change in that person. And
Wow.
so either the relapse cycle continues or she stops and finally gets away.
So I would imagine that one of the things that would be super important is if you think you are with someone that is like this, when you make that decision or before you make that decision to leave, getting counseling is something that is super important. And I would imagine finding someone like yourself that specializes in this area is really, really important.
It is very important. And to make sure that your therapist is trained in personality disorders is one of the things that you want to look for. And especially if they have knowledge of pathological love relationships, that's very important as well. They can always go to the Institute for Relational Harm Reduction, which is saferelationshipsmagazine.com, saferelationshipsmagazine.com. And they also have a great recovery group there that's very affordable. I highly recommend that over Facebook groups or bloggers. And also, too, one of the ways that I always tell clients right off the bat is be sure not to read things that aren't written by people that are clinicians. So they either have some letters before or after their name, and there's research attached to what you're reading, because there's a lot of wounded people out there writing, and so you just don't want to cause more harm to yourself.
Absolutely. There is a ton of that. Somebody has read something and thinks that their situation fits, perfectly into that pattern.
Correct. Yeah.
So I'm glad that we know that. So I'm sorry I had interrupted you on that. Wanted to.
No, that's good. No, we needed to cover that.
Yeah. Let's go back then. I see that then talking about coercive control.
Yeah.
So can you describe a little bit of what that is?
Yeah. Coercive control is where there's threats, where they threaten harm or threaten the behavior. Let me get back to where I was. It's very threatening and isolating. So they literally are taking control of the victim's life, and so that's coercive control. And there's actually now the UK has started legislation on coercive control, and if it can be proven, they actually have fines and even jail time for that now. It has not made its way to the States yet, but it's very much about what we're talking about. But they're calling it, instead of I was in a relationship with a narcissist, they're calling it a coercive control bill.
That's an interesting subject matter. I mean, that's something that we ought to talk about. And how do you legislate that exactly effectively?
Right.
I'd be super interested to learn about what their prosecution numbers are, the number of cases that they've actually taken up, and the number that they've been successful on prosecuting.
That would be interesting. We should look into that for another show.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about then a little bit I want to skip forward because I know we're up against our time limit.
Right.
But one of the things that it talks about in post-separation abuse is legal abuse. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that and get an understanding of what that is and what I, as a lawyer, can do to kind of sniff this out a little bit.
One of the first things you'll see is they'll go for 50-50 custody, or they'll go for full custody.
Right.
One of the two. Instead of standard.
Right.
Most always, that's what's involved. And then if the safe parent, like for instance, let me give you a case in point. So like if a safe parent is asked to allow the unsafe parent visitation on an off week. Right. And the safe parent says no because they have commitments like volleyball or swimming lessons or whatever.
Right.
The unsafe parent will claim parental alienation, and
Right.
they will take them back to court.
Right.
And so they're usually doing that to financially drain the safe parent. And so they'll find all kinds of reasons to drag them back into court. And so, like, every time they turn around, if they didn't, the safe parent forgot to let them know that they took them to a doctor's appointment, well, they're not following the court orders, and so they take them back to court. And so they look for any little thing to try to draw the safe parent back into court. And so typically that's what the legal abuse means.
Gotcha. Okay. And unfortunately, there are plenty of lawyers out there who would be willing to take up those cases that are just little BS type cases that
Right.
really, yeah, I wouldn't waste my time
I had
on.
one
but-
reach out to me not long ago that was being taken back to court for like the 15th time, and all the papers said this last time was it was for cause, and she had no idea what she was going to court for. And so the paperwork just said she was to appear for cause.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I could speculate on that,
Yeah.
but I'm going to keep from that. So,
Yeah.
I'll tell you what I want to do next time, because as we have talked about, you will be a recurring
Yeah.
guest on the Reclamation Transformation podcast. And so I want to go into the financial abuse a little bit more, and then how that leads into the counter parenting.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot more to talk about
A
here.
lot more to talk
Yeah, and
yeah.
then we'll get into some more of the things that we needed to discuss. So thank you so much
Thank you.
for being here today, and thank y'all for joining us in another episode of the Reclamation Transformation. And remember, change begins with you, so make sure to leave your mark.